Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to welcome you here to this YAI event, this webinar. It's a real and even greater pleasure to be able to welcome here with us in our premises Aleš Meller. Aleš is Deputy Foreign Minister of the Czech Republic, and I have just learned that we were both fellows of the Center for European Policy Studies in earlier days. So we have just discovered that we have a shared background in some respects. Over the course of the next hour, what I really wanted to do in conversation with Aleš is an exchange with him on, in a sense, the state of our European Union, and in particular, how we have coped over the course of this pandemic, what this pandemic has taught us as European Union. Have we kind of refound our soul again within the European project? But also what this and how this has positioned us in terms of what our broader global goals are concerned. This European Commission came in by saying it was going to be a geopolitical commission. I mean, of course, this predates the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, but what can be said about this agenda of the European Union? So perhaps, Aleš, to kick us off, let me turn to you to sort of ask you what your take is. I mean, you know, some people have looked at the impact of COVID on the European Union as basically sort of representing the the final death blow to the European project. Others have talked about COVID-19 as the proverbial sort of crisis that was transformed into an opportunity. How have you read the last year and a half of European integration?
So first of all, thank you very much. I would like to thank the IAI Institute and specifically Natalie for having me here. I mean, my perspective on the current affairs in the EU will be necessarily also a Central European perspective or a Czech perspective, but due to my background, I will of course not just try, but somehow unavoidably, I will also put a sort of analytical part. So the things that I will say will not be necessarily part of the government positions in this respect. But on the very good question on how did we do since roughly February or March last year, I think that overall, when we see and can evaluate the situation today, I think that we did relatively very well. I wouldn't go much further in saying that we have managed it in an excellent way. Why so? Because the crisis or the pandemic is not yet over, and the repercussions, long-term repercussions, are certainly not over, because we are still somehow inside the overall shock, and not all the issues are solved. But on the first moment, during the first wave, what was clear that the first days and weeks when borders started to be closed, when individual countries started to react also in terms of a control of the single market. So, for example, banning exports of some key protective materials or of disinfectants. It seemed that EU and repatriation of citizens, which was a big chapter actually at the beginning of the first wave of COVID. It saw, or the impression, at least from Czechia, and I would say from a wider Central European region, was that the EU was absent. At the first moments, you saw that the EU was mostly trying to stick to the classical acquis, so free movement of goods, free movement of people, but has not realized, in my opinion, has not realized the level of challenge or the size of the challenge that the pandemic has presented to the overall EU and to the functioning, be it of the EU, I mean, single market specifically, but also to the EU as such. But very, I would say, consistently, even though it took some time, the reaction came, and rules, more general rules on exemptions, on how to manage borders have come into play. They have never been, nevertheless, fully harmonized, because the approach from individual member states. Almost every single of them was national and was individual. In our case, what we saw emerge in the first weeks was regional cooperation, especially with our south and southeast neighbors, and with Germany, because what we had to deal with was a very specific issue of border controls and the impact on on free movement of goods. And we are somehow, the Czech Republic finds itself on a road from basically the whole Western Balkan and Balkan region, and Germany, and basically the Benelux countries. So this was an issue that we have been dealing on a very regional basis, and we have established very quickly somehow flexible regional cooperation. Even a new grouping, almost a political regional grouping has been born out of this crisis, called Central Five, which is Czech Republic, Slovakia, Austria, Slovenia, and Hungary. So somehow a V4 minus Poland plus Austria and Slovenia. And it now starts to have also a normal agenda. So it might have also in those terms, this type of regional cooperation, some further implications. Why am I saying that? Is that every single member state, in this grouping at least, would have preferred a European response. But for obvious reasons, and not of reasons I would say that the European Commission would be in control of, the individual countries were trying to have their own approach, and they were responsible to a certain very chaotic and psychologically difficult demands from the citizens. So they had to react individually, and this is something that we have to learn from, but I think we should not reproach it, or we should not be setting that this was a failure of the EU. But the first moment was a certain absence of the EU. Also in repatriation, which was a big exercise that we have gone through in the first weeks when the first wave started. It took also some weeks before the common emergency mechanism kicked in, but I am proud to say that the Czech Republic was the first recipient actually of this help, even though it was exposed, but we have managed to somehow connect the lines. We managed to take up to 900, which doesn't sound as so many, but 900 people repatriated from other EU member states. By plane, and thousands by other means, by the way, but we don't have a specific count. So that was the first wave. Then the critical situation came with how to recover. And then I think that at least on a political level, not yet implementation, because the NGEU is not yet fully implemented, of course. There are, if I'm not mistaken, still member states who have not submitted their national recovery plans, and it's pending a decision of the Council, of course. So then the recovery plan came, and I think that July 2020 will be in the future taken as a really historical moment, because we have been discussing a very similar instrument, and I'm saying the obvious for those who deal with this issue, but we have been dealing with this question of a sort of mutualization of debt and collective responsibility for financial instruments for at least 10 years, if not longer, actually. And I think but I know that many economists have been suggesting it from the very beginning of the Eurozone creation. And we are happy as Czechia, as a non-Eurozone member still, that it was still made on a framework of the EU, but the principle was something that was thought as a sort of cure to the overall Eurozone issues for 10 years. So it was this so-called Hamiltonian moment. Just the very day that the Commission approved it, I was at a seminar with Elisa Ferreira, and she was completely enthusiastic. Actually, she was saying this is really history being written, and I agreed with her. But still, this is an action that will last longer. First, we have to approve the plans. Member states will have to implement them. They will have to, fulfill the line of projects. And the key question is what will become of this instrument in the future. We have to find own resources. We have to find ways to pay back. So we have agreed that it will be a collective responsibility to pay back, but we have not agreed on how exactly we will pay back. So this is still an open question and will somehow determine the level of success and the level of Hamiltonianism, let's say, of this July 2020 moment. It is still to be seen. And I think we cannot exclude, considering the future potential moods of individual member states and the need for consensus, we cannot exclude that the main part still will be paid in the old way, let's say, based on GNI, for example. So this is still an open question that needs to be treated. We have roughly 3 to 4 years for a political debate maximum. And we need to get back to this question. And then the big question is whether this instrument will be able to continue. whether it was an ad hoc one or whether we are really creating something as a European treasury indeed and a common debt instrument, which is a key component of, I would say, a proto-federal union in this respect. So this is to be seen. And so that was the good moment in summer 2020. Then there was a moment that was taken with a certain hesitation, and that was the first attempts to get contracts on the first batches of vaccination. And there, even though it was successful, and we see now that basically the supply is matching demand almost in all member states, and we are getting to a degree where vaccination has a real impact on the mortality, of course, but also on the functioning and the possibility of the economies to open. From today's perspective, it seems completely fine, but there were many paradoxes that the EU will have to deal with, and there was a certain frustration at many points where we have to realize that the way and the position, the political position of power of the EU was extremely weak. At the same moments where we were fighting for having the vaccines delivered to the most vulnerable citizens, at the same moment where many member states had zero or none vaccines at all, vaccines have been exported from the EU territory to other states which base their vaccination success actually on vaccines invented and produced, at least partially and sometimes fully, in the European Union. This paradox of a certain, what many have called a certain European naivete, will have to be tackled in the future, not necessarily in sectors of health and of vaccination, but to be able to prepare for another type of crisis. I'm not sure what the first or the next crisis might be, but certainly, let me say, the next crisis will not be, let us hope at least, or we will see, not be based on a health issue. It will not be a pandemics issue. So we have to learn in a more general way. It is very often said that EU or states or in general markets are preparing for the same crisis as they just went through, but they are not able to prepare for the next crisis. So we need a certain reflection. We know areas where to focus. So we have a lesson from health sector, but we need new sectors to be opened. If the new crisis is cyber based or something, then it is quite flagrant how, for example, few microprocessors the EU produces on its territory. And this is a weakness of a magnitude that could be fatal actually in future critical situation. So overall, I think we've done quite well. I think that the absence of the EU at some points and the lack of power or the position of power from which the EU, for example, negotiated during the vaccination run, I would call it, was to be taken a lesson from and to prepare for the next crisis. But overall, I do assess it positively. And I think that Europe has come certainly stronger out of the COVID, which I think nobody at the beginning actually has expected that it could happen, but has come stronger than before and trying to deal with real issues. So on this note, I'm quite optimistic.
Yes, Alish, I would agree with you. I mean, I was fascinated to hear, and I wasn't aware of it, in a sense how the Czech Republic dealt with those first weeks and a couple of months in which indeed there was a European an EU absence, and sort of fascinating to look at the way in which, in a sense, you turned to your closest neighbors. I mean, if I were to sort of rewind back and to think about the situation here in Italy, I mean, of course, we didn't have many neighbors to turn to because we were the first in line, in a sense, during that first wave. And indeed, in those first weeks, there was very much this sense in Italy of, here they go again. They let us down during the Eurozone crisis. They let us down during the so-called migration crisis, and they're letting us down again. And I think that, and sort of connecting to the points that you were then making, I think that it is to be recognized, the fact that there was a recognition that had this crisis been the third crisis in which there was a perceived sense of lack of solidarity, it would have been a crisis too many for the European project to endure. And it didn't happen. And in a sense, I think through the pandemic, we did rediscover that magic word that is at the heart of European integration, which is solidarity. which I think, as you rightly say, it's a word that has to be not necessarily only applied to one policy area. I mean, it has to be applied to all policy areas, because it is the magic word, in a sense, that lies at the heart of the European project. And I think that sort of through solidarity, and in a sense through discovering that, you know, there are many things that divide us. At times we have different interests. At times we even have different values. I mean, let's face it. And more, I'll get back to sort of also questions concerning rule of law, which obviously don't concern your particular country, but it concerns a couple of your neighbours. But sorry. But sort of just to finish off that reasoning there, you know, I think through the sort of refinding of solidarity and sort of rediscovering that we are a community of fate, because we can only exit a crisis like a pandemic, and arguably many other crises, by sticking together, was really, I think, the fundamental thing that the fundamental lesson, in a sense, from the pandemic. In a sense, I think through it, there has also been the opportunity to, well, firstly, I would say sort of dust off the shelf the work left half finished with the Eurozone crisis. So in a sense, you know, if one rewinds back to the Four Presidents report of 2012, that sort of were paving the way from the banking union to the fiscal union to a political union. And of course, we only half finished the first step, and we didn't even begin the second and the third. And in a sense, Next Generation EU is an opportunity to go back to that second and third step. As you say, a lot of it, you know, the proof is going to be in the pudding, because very clearly, if you know, if the program not only having been approved, but if it's actually implemented well, if it actually does lead to greater convergence within the European Union, within the Eurozone, then obviously this sort of creates, I mean, it validates the argument of basically saying we can move towards a fuller mutualization of debt. We can move towards the development of own resources in a more meaningful way. If it's not, of course, the boomerang effect would be massive. But at least now we have an opportunity to continue along that path. And I think the third reason why this has been so important is that it has provided, in a sense, the European Union with a story to tell. I mean, this Commission came in saying three things. I mean, I was mentioning geopolitical earlier, but I'll just leave that to one side for the time being. But it came in saying green, saying digital, and saying geopolitical. You know, the green and the digital before COVID-19 were, in all honesty, little more than slogans. Now it's slogans with a lot of money behind them. And it's two terms that resonate with younger generations. You know, they provide an opportunity for the union to have a story to tell internally as well as globally. And I think that, you know, this has been, again, the sort of the third proverbial opportunity, in a sense, to be reaped from the crisis. I wanted to perhaps move to precisely one of these questions, and in particular the climate question and the energy transition question. I mean, it seems clear to me that, you know, obviously the ambition is there, the goals are there, but if we kind of think at what, for instance, happened last week, where, you know, this is a theme on which we are still quite deeply divided in many respects. And it seems obvious that if we are to move towards net neutrality by 2050, then it's clear that this has to go hand in hand with an equally sort of intense effort at moving along the track of just transition. sort of your part of Europe has really been sort of at the forefront of highlighting just how important this is. Perhaps if you could say a few words about what your personal take and how this debate looks like from your standpoint.
I think that there is now a growing consensus, of course, that carbon neutrality carbon neutrality like zero carbon is probably sort of fiction. So it will really depend on the composition of, I mean, there will never be a zero CO2 emission, of course, but there are compensation mechanisms, etc. But the very idea of the fact that there needs to be a climate transition and the technologies have to adjust, I think is or has been gradually accepted actually throughout Europe. I wouldn't say, and I wouldn't make a geographic division nevertheless, because what we saw as reactions in Europe, for example, in France, in the form of the Yellow Vests movement, or also of some visible protests of farmers in the Netherlands, very visible ones, so that maybe it's not the question on whether we fight climate change or not, but who bears the cost of this. And that is an open question. I think that now most of the parties, I mean, inside Europe, and when you look at the parliaments, not to the governments, because it's also kind of tricky to say that one country thinks one thing when you have a, well, so overall, the composition of parliaments in individual member states is such that quasi-totality of the parties actually do accept that climate change, of course, exists, that it needs to be prevented, and some adjustment also needs to take place with some costs. But the way how the cost will be redistributed is the key question that we will have to bear. And if I'm afraid, talking more from a social democratic perspective, but I'm afraid that if we put the costs on ordinary people, to simplify a little bit, it will be an activity that will not be successful. And you will not see maybe Central Europe protesting, but at some point you will see different parts of Europe protesting. At some point, maybe one government, at another point, another one, but we need consistency. So we need to find a way how exactly to cover these costs, which would not be degressive. And the current proposals, I mean, the simple, I would say, way to increase the price of carbon, increase the price of carbon heavy products in general, is a way that can fall disproportionately on the population. To simplify a little bit, and you know that all very well, but you know, higher middle class or higher class, how to call it, will always be able to afford to travel by plane. They will always able to buy themselves an electric car, which is 30–40% costlier than a usual one. They will always be able to buy you know, beef, for example, if the price doubles. But who would bear these consequences in terms of their level of living, in terms of standard of living, will be indeed the middle class. And this is, we can make philosophical tractates on the character of this redistribution, but it will not, I'm afraid, have a long-term popular support, the measures. I mean, the idea is somehow accepted, but the way how to get there is key. And specifically in Central Europe, this feeling due to the costs linked to the transformation of the energy sector, especially from coal, first probably to gas partially, and then to renewables, is extremely costly. If you exclude from the schemes of support nuclear, which is also an important part of Europe, also Central Europe, then you get to costs that are, I would say, not exponentially, but strikingly higher than in some other member states. So it's not about, I would say, ethical positioning towards climate change, but it is about, I would say, almost objective, materialistic worries about how to cover this. We have now tools to adjust for this. We have common mechanisms on this modernization fund, and we have tools to get there, but it will still be long, and we need to accept that that the costs will not be necessarily those that, or that for some countries they will have to somehow compensate in others, that it's a common effort. And one big issue, and I think the biggest issue, will be how to handle and coordinate the global response. Because if we get in Europe by 2050 or slightly later, I also suppose, to zero carbon emissions, it would be a huge effort. I always say, you know, coming from a purely marginalistic economic tradition, that the last CO2 molecule will be the most costly. It would cost probably millions of euros at the end, because the more you get to the zero, the costlier it is. But we will have to weigh the reaction in the world and the level of activities that we have. That is why there is a debate on carbon leakage. That is why there is a debate on the border adjustment mechanism. Because if we do not handle this, what will happen is basically that all the CO2 related activities or carbon heavy activities will move somewhere else, and that Europe will somehow live in a skansen or in a museum of zero CO2 emissions, while the world will continue actually on its way. So this is a big challenge. Without having a compliance or a global compliance of the biggest emitters in the world, it will be an, I would say, useless exercise to use controversial words.
Yes, I mean, I think I totally agree with you. I mean, I think this, and you put it, I think you put it fantastically well. I mean, I think this is not just, I mean, sort of beginning with the just transition part. It's not obviously just a question, sort of, you know, a question between different countries, between different member states. I think you're right. I think that the even more sort of pressing question and challenge is the intra-member state dynamic. And in a sense, it is clear that sort of if the transition is pursued without this really in mind, it is clear that the risk is that of exacerbating inequalities in a way in which we haven't even begun to imagine. And one then thinks through what the political consequences of that may be in terms of strengthening, you know, perhaps a new brand of nationalist populism. I mean, you can see the way it's a bit like with the discussion with COVID, you know, if left kind of as is, the risk is that of exacerbating inequalities tremendously. And of course, it's exactly what is happening. It's happening in the case of COVID between countries, richer countries being vaccinated, poorer countries not, and it's happening within countries. I mean, in the way, for instance, the pandemic affected, obviously, more disadvantaged classes, you know, if one thinks about the case of the United States, for example. And I think the same argument can be made about the energy transition and the climate crisis more broadly, which is why it is so important to devote as much effort to one side of the equation as to the other, I think. Let me I know, and the other point I wanted to actually raise on this, where I totally agree with you, is also thinking about the global dimension of all of this and the carbon pricing aspect to all of this. I mean, I think that the challenge really as Europeans is, yes, indeed, that of developing a carbon border adjustment mechanism, but the truth is that this is only really going to make sense if it spills into a broader global carbon pricing, and I think it's a step-by-step process. I mean, I think the sort of first port of call is really transatlantic. You know, if with the Biden administration, one moves to greater convergence, not only as is happening now on issues like climate finance or climate risk disclosure, for instance, but also on issues of carbon pricing, then at that point you have a relatively significant critical mass, which becomes difficult, for instance, for China to ignore. But it has to be, in a sense, a concentric circle, if you like, approach. Let me turn to the sort of delicate question of sort of democracy and rule of law. I mean, it seems to me that, you know, sort of, and one can look at it globally and one can obviously look at it in intra-European terms. It is clear that I think at the global level, there is, I mean, and this I think has become even clearer over the course of this pandemic, you have a sort of global confrontation which is crystallizing as ultimately a confrontation between political ideologies and political systems. So, you know, if we take the US-China question, pre-COVID, we used to think of it as a set of different disputes, whether it was tariffs, whether it was 5G, whether it was the South China Sea. And I think over the course of the pandemic, it has become increasingly clear that this is really a confrontation between political systems. And of course, it's not just a global story, but it's also an internal European as well as American story. So the fact that there are competing political ideologies within liberal democracies. I mean, think obviously of the events of 6th of January in Washington, DC as the most kind of prominent example. But it's clear that also in Europe, we do have problems in terms of democratic backsliding, which is of course a problem for the European Union, which ultimately whereas I think, let me put it this way, I think it's possible to have European countries which are not democratic. I mean, sort of history teaches us that this has been the case. I don't think that it's possible to have a European Union that is not based upon the values of liberal democracy. And yet we don't quite know what to do and how to handle. I mean, I don't think we've still found the right recipe by the looks of it in terms of what to do when those values are being violated within the Union. What's your view on all of this?
I think that on many questions, actually, these topics that we have already discussed, for example, climate and who bears the cost, and overall the inequality, also the impact of COVID pandemics is very much intertwined, very much linked to the topic of respect of values and of democracy. I mean, you said well that this is a global issue, that this is an issue that somehow is intrinsic now to the liberal democracy or liberal democracies, if we can use this term. And that it is a critical sign, in my view, of a wider and even more global change in geopolitical positioning. Because we've, let us be honest, I mean, what we are working today with are institutions that were born after the Second World War. We have seen them being put in question, I think, most actively by the form, not just by China and by challenges actually to the current world order, which everybody sees and somehow recognizes that this is the case, but also by the past American administration, which went basically step by step of almost every single post-World War institution and putting impediments actually into its functioning, trying to call for a sort of renewal, maybe more concentric or maybe more regional, less multilateral, but it was an attempt to change the rules. If we take a more materialistic view of history, this is not, it has not come out of nothing. It has come from a certain structural change in society, and the 6th of January this year in the US was a symbol, or was a symptom of these changes. So we need to be able to somehow analyze what is happening, the pressures and the frictions with the current system, with the current institutions, which at least during the past administration, US administration, have been under strong pressure, and they were close to collapse on some instance. I was in Geneva 2 years ago, and you could see actually parts of the building somehow crumbling, and it was a very symbolic that an institution that, League of Nations and then UN started to somehow get physically damaged by the lack of funds that the UN was going through in that period, and which was targeted and fortunately now being somehow returned to more normal side. But you saw these institutions to get into a critical situation where there was no plan B, there was no scenario to reform, but it was clear that one equilibrium, the post-World War equilibrium, is trying to move to a different equilibrium. I'm very, I would say, general or very, very well, generalistic in this assessment, very abstract, but I think that indeed, due to the balance of powers in the world, and I will remain a little bit abstract, there is a new equilibrium that the current system is trying to push through. And since it has its frame, it has its tools and institutions which try to keep the system in place, it creates frictions and it creates stress on key points. In normal times, you would have a conflict, I would say. You would have a certain crisis, deeper crisis, not endogenous crisis. You would have not exogenous crisis, but endogenous crisis, sort of a war, if I were to be too explicit. This is how things have happened when balance of powers was moving from one equilibrium to the other. And we are in this moment of a strong friction. It's like, during an earthquake when the two tectonic plates are pressing to each other, and then to move and to get into a new equilibrium. I'm exaggerating and being too abstract a little bit, but you have the earthquake, then, and it gets again to a stable equilibrium. So this is what we're going through. And my hope is that our institutions and our, I think, meta institutions and the capacity to see how institutions do work are capable of preventing the earthquake in a way, which was not the case during the Second World War. For example, it was not the case during before the Westphalian Treaty, before the Congress of Vienna, where we needed sort of a war to get a new order of things. I am optimistic. I'm not certain that this will happen, but it has to be really in depth. And I think we should be very much explicit in this debate. For example, and I don't have a clear lesson. I will not actually give examples, but I will. Sometimes I like to use actually a quotation from Leopardo, from the leopard of the Lampedusa, this very famous sentence that everything has to change so that nothing changes. There was a revolutionary times in Italy in those times when things were moving. And I think that this somehow, in this abstract way, I think it would start to be controversial if I were to be too concrete. But in an abstract way, this is what we have in front of us. I mean, that many things have to change so that we keep the level of standard of living, the peaceful cooperation in the world, the level of cooperation, and the level or accepted level of or extent of globalization in the world. So in a way, the 6th of January, yellow vests, many other events in Europe, even I would say the controversies that we have on some questions inside Europe, based on geography or internally, are a sort of wake-up calls. Those are the pre-earthquake sounds that need us to wake up a little bit and approach this question actively. I'm hopeful that this is happening. For example, that the current administration has learned lessons actually from the level of liquid anger of the people, not on the 6th of January, but those that got the last administration to power, and that they can somehow contain and address the real issue of these people. I don't have a lesson how to do it, but without this, there will be always a challenge to values and to democracy, and we will not solve it in the courts. We will not solve it in the ECJ. We will not even solve it by Article 7, I'm afraid, because this is top down, but there is something happening on the ground, if I exaggerate a little bit. I hope I was not too abstract.
No, I think I'll come to this in a minute. Before I do, I see questions are starting to come in. I'll start coming to these questions in a moment, so please keep on sort of adding yours. Before I do, I wanted to actually use what you just last said to make the transition to the third set of issues that I wanted to touch on, which are really about foreign policy. And in a sense, again, sort of starting with the US parallel, you see the Biden administration articulating its foreign policy, or the goal of its foreign policy is a foreign policy for the middle class. And obviously the way and the reason why the Biden administration is doing this is precisely because of what you were saying. Unless policies, including foreign policy, delivers for the middle class, then there will be there will be that erosion of democracy from within. So I think it's very much connected to what you were saying, and where at the end of the day, liberal democracies are going to survive and to thrive to the extent that they are seen as delivering to their citizens, which also connects back to what we were talking about in terms of pandemics and in terms of energy transition, etc. Now, in many respects, one can look at the European debate about autonomy and strategic autonomy as being, I would consider this, and I would love your take on this, as being the European equivalent of the foreign policy for the middle class. Not in the way in which the debate on strategic autonomy started. I mean, the debate on strategic autonomy essentially started as a debate about security and defense. And I mean, in all honesty, I think, we're probably light years away, basically becoming autonomous when it comes to security and defense. But I think what's interesting about this is that over the years, this is a debate that has extended to other policy areas. I mean, it's extended to the digital area, to, I would say, to industrial policy more broadly, to energy, to climate. I mean, one can even make the argument about migration and autonomy. And underpinning all of this is the sense, I think, that whereas once upon a time, we were simply into the ball game of promoting our values externally, now we're as much, if not more, in the ball game of protecting those values, because there are external players that actually do want to interfere in different policy areas, to impinge upon those norms and those rules and those interests and those values. So I think in many respects, the US the US foreign policy for the middle class, the European strategic autonomy agenda are connected to one another. They're connected to one another, and I think precisely because of this, they run a similar risk. Because on the one hand, I think there is the healthy preoccupation about protection for the reasons that we were discussing, but there is also the risk of protection sliding into protectionism. And so I was wondering if I could have your take both on this broader debate about European strategic autonomy, how you see it, how it's seen from the Czech Republic, but also to the extent that there is something healthy to the agenda, how do we pursue this agenda without falling into the trap of external protectionism, as well as, I would say, internal exacerbating internal balances, again, in support of the strong, and the big and the strong, and to the detriment of the smaller and the weaker.
I mean, that's a very good point. I mean, it's quite funny because I've used many of your terms that you've just used in an article that or a report that will be published any day as part of the GlobSec report on strategic autonomy from a Central and Eastern European perspective, especially the fact that it started, of course, and this is obvious, but it started as a security debate, and I think that as part of a security debate, it doesn't have a solution. I mean, in the current world order, it does not have a solution, and there are, I think, no specific alternatives to the current setting, with an exemption of Europe, of course, being or having a potential to deal with its neighborhood more actively and to take more responsibility for its security, I would say regional or local security. But security being put aside, which is, I think, a debate that we will not be able to move forward, and it was I wouldn't say a dead end, but almost, I mean, close to this. But on the economic side, specifically ranging from digital to health and energy, this is an issue that, surprisingly enough, it started in 2019, or, well, concretely enough, it started in 2019 with this failed fusion disapproved fusion of Alstom and Siemens, and the wake-up call that it has caused in Germany and France in terms of how can we compete globally if our own level playing field and basically free competition or fair competition rules inside the EU are preventing us from becoming strong enough in order to compete globally. So this paradox was obvious, it was flagrant, it was very clear, and France and Germany have started to argue very specifically in favor of reforming actually the competition policy of the EU. So this was the first flag, and then paradoxically it was disrupted. This debate was somehow interrupted by COVID, but reinforced by COVID also on different schemes. And I think it has become clear that Europe has to be less naive, it has to be more pragmatic or more instrumental. still respect, key principles, especially rule of law in terms of accepting the rules as they are set, accepting the institutional setting, but maybe trying not to be overachiever in terms of trying to get, I would say, go to the strict. It sounds a little bit cynical, but go to the strict minimum of adherence to rules in order to be able to compete. Because if the others, they take opportunity to subsidize their companies, be it by partially or fictional or virtual state ownership, such as in China, or by also specific research-based subsidies, as in other non-EU countries. This will leave Europe, in the very long term, uncompetitive. This is not a global response. This is something which should calibrate the position of Europe towards other states. The vaccination was a case in point. I talked about this at the very same moment when we were lacking vaccines inside the EU, when we were fighting legal wars with the producers of vaccines on the European territory. So in the same time, vaccines were leaving the EU territory. This is something, unimaginable in China, in the United States, or even in Russia. Well, not even, I think specifically in Russia, it would be unimaginable. But so this is something that we need to, somehow get to a certain solution. And but this will be a relative, I would say, it will not be creating a global solution. It will just, recalibrate the position of Europe and being able to fulfill its needs a little bit better. And most importantly, because it might become and should become more pragmatic, it should also make enforceability, if it's the right spelling, of its own interests in the world better. So if you are more pragmatic and more interest-based, it sounds not so idealistically, but it's a current way of affairs in the world. Then we might be also able to enforce our relations and our trade relations with other countries. So why am I saying this? Is because I think that we do not need to necessarily repatriate, some activities or somehow shrink the globalization towards the EU level, but that we need to be respected so that we can count on some. We need to have levers. I've mentioned the microprocessors. If we produce zero microprocessors in the EU or competitive microprocessors in the EU, it's impossible to be able to even sustain or to have a lever in terms of even imports of microprocessors, because we depend on imports of these products. If we have at least an alternative that is scalable in the future, then we have a more position of power to negotiate bid price, of course, but also the resilience or the very fact that we can be the reliability of the imports. So this is a key debate, not easy one, because we will need to invent also inside the EU mechanisms of compensation, because there will be losers and winners of this policy as compared to the status quo. And it's not easy, and it will be very much internal debate at the same time. From the Czech perspective, what we think we need to do is to avoid unnecessary protectionism, of course, and somehow not to put under the impression that this policy is targeted towards our allies. I think this is the key 2 points that we have specifically in Central Europe, in wider region, I would say, of Central Europe in this debate. But otherwise, more power, more global autonomy somehow is something that we support very much.
Now, let me start turning. I see it's many questions already coming in, so I'm going to try and squeeze as many in as possible. I will merge actually the first question by Leonora and a question by Giuseppe, because they're both on Next Generation EU. And basically the future direction of travel of Next Generation EU and the extent to which this program has the potential to reshape or rebuild the social contract between EU member states and citizens. Yeah, I mean, whether the Next Generation EU has the potential to reshape or to rebuild the social contract between EU member states and citizens.
Even for me, that's a little abstract question, but I think that it has a big potential, especially in countries who, objectively speaking, have been sort of left aside in the Eurozone crisis and to a large extent also to the migration crisis, speaking openly. I think this is a sort of signal that that there is social contract inside the EU, that there is a sort of inherent, sometimes selfish, but still solidarity. Why am I saying selfish? Is because I think that the realization that half of Europe would collapse was the main reason why many countries were able to go over their main internal impediments actually during the COVID pandemic, because of the level of critical situation that we had in these times. So it was kind of selfish, or not selfish, it was to a large extent also made for self-interest, even in countries which would have not profited necessarily in netto from this perspective. But it shows that, in my view, this shows that we can act together. We just need more motivation. I wouldn't go so far that it could really, repair the social fabric, because I think that despite all the aspects of green and digital and also social and inside or fair aspect, it is still, and I will be a little bit cynical, it is still just what is revolutionary is this collective approach, not necessarily the content. We would have we would be doing green or transition and then digital policies anyway. We would have to invest a lot of money. So I do not think that the very character of the NGEU and of the national recovery plans will change much in terms of where Europe would have headed without this and without COVID, but that it has created a sort of bridge financing or bridge instrument so that it can survive difficult times and focus on its future. But recreating social fabric is a different discipline than specifically the NGEU, in my opinion.
Yes, I agree, and I also agree on what you were saying earlier about solidarity as being the product, which I think is the way in which solidarity is not. It's not the product of altruism or generosity. It's the product of interest. But in a sense, the fact that it's the product of interest, the product of interest, is a guarantee that it's solid, if you like. There's a question from Liviu. There is a question, I'm going to try and sort of paraphrase it a little bit. It's about corruption. It's about corruption, about organized crime, in relation to, if you like, vaccines, medical equipment, but I think it's a broader question about sort of corruption and the extent to which this has been one of the main elements sort of hampering trust, by European citizens towards institutions.
Well, I think that organized crime is it has a legal definition, but what we've seen in the pandemics, for example, this was a sort of disloyal competition or hoarding or speculation that I think was close to the definition of organized crime, but that it showed that we need tools to maybe better tackle the supply and demand in the market. And I'm not going to use the term of price regulation, but to have tools actually, which was the case, by the way, in many countries. Price regulation still applies in many member states for vaccination, for health protective materials, or for disinfectants, for example. But and of course for end users of vaccines. But that would be a too long an answer from my side. But maybe sometimes we need to look at the corruption in general, not necessarily as or organized crime necessarily as a thing that again could be prevented only by enforcement, but by looking to the causes actually of the corruption. I traveled in Eastern Europe recently, and what I saw was that corruption and organized crime in those countries was a way of, it was part of the equilibrium in a way. You corrupt somebody, but you think you will be also corrupted, so you will get part of the let's say benefit from the game. If you stop getting corrupted, you will lose out. So you play the game. It's part again of the equilibrium. And I think that we should not make conclusions out of specific crises like the one on during the pandemics. I think that this is people started to behave in a criminal way because they saw an opportunity of their life, maybe to get enough money for the rest of their life. But this is not. I think and I hope that this is not structural. So I'm not sure I answered exactly, but some thoughts on that certainly.
No, I think that's right. Let me turn to a question. Ralph asks a question about, given a lot of what we were talking about earlier, the sort of, the fragility of democracy, both in the European Union and the United States, what is the prospects for the transatlantic alliance in terms of the broader theme about promoting democracy, world democracy, etc.?
That's a very good question, because we've just talked about more pragmatic, more interest-based policy, be it for the middle class or for overall representation of interest. And it's difficult to, or there is a trade-off, let us be honest, between capacity to be acting on a value-based system or on an interest-based system. I mean, our task is to combine it most efficiently so that it is in line, but there is a sort of trade-off. I mean, we have to be clear, by definition, there is a sort of trade-off in those actions. I would predict, there was a bad joke circulating on the 6th of January that US was exporting democracy so much that it had not enough left at home. And I'm not saying that this is correct, but there was a feeling of many people who thought that you're fighting for democracy in the world. That was, the feeling of the people in the capital, I suppose. You're fighting for democracy in the world, but our voice is not heard. We are democracy. We are here to tell you what you should do. We've elected somebody. We think we decide, not you decide in that room. So this, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but I think that the great times of common attempts to really be able to somehow stick and force to push other countries towards democracy will come through difficult times, because everybody will try to be more pragmatic.
Yes, perhaps looking at it. Looking at the glass half full, one could also make the argument of saying, well, being aware of the fragilities of our own democracy, and therefore being aware that democracy is a journey, it can go forwards, it can go backwards, actually puts us also in some respects better place, perhaps in a more humble place, to talk about democracy in countries that are also facing their own journey, if you like. So rather than, in a sense, sort of standing on a pedestal and kind of telling people what to do, coming to the question, to the values question, also by showing what our own weaknesses are, and that can perhaps also create a different atmosphere in that conversation. I want to try and squeeze two, if you're very quick, two final questions. I want to tell them, say both of them. One from Giovanni. That is really about the sustainability of national debts, which are obviously now soaring at sort of triple digits, and basically sort of how you see the debate about public debt. And then a final question from Francesco that is about China, and in particular China and the Balkans.
Well, on national debt, I have to admit I have a more Keynesian approach. So I think that what decides mostly is not who owns the debt, or not whether it's public or private, the debt, but what is the external balance of the debt. And it really varies from state to state. And this determines the overall stability of debt and the capacity to repay it. I would have to look at numbers actually to make some further comments, but I think that national debt per se is not an issue, but the external debt and the control of monetary policy is the key issue. So, and we've seen a tremendous and incredible evolution of tools from the ECB in the past 10 years. I do expect that they would evolve further actually in the next years in terms of attempts to repay back the parts of the debt. I'm not saying that some revolutionary steps would come, but I'm pretty sure that the ECB and the monetary policy will have to come somehow at the assistance of this tool, which would not be consistent with some type of rules, but again, it would be a sort of a pragmatic period at some point that we will have to go through. But again, I might be on a margin of, or let's say on one side of the economic debate in general, not saying that my view on this is objective. On China, in Western Balkans, on China everywhere, by the way, I think that's the key, and that might have been actually the bridge between the US and the EU, is that it's value and democracy, but not just that, it's also common interest that somehow link us with the US actually very much together. And the level and the way of functioning, I think, of Chinese economy and of Chinese politics is so inherently different that we need to be able to face it together. In Western Balkans, this is, I think, a case in a point. When we see and when we talk individually to sometime into states in Western Balkans, the 6 specifically, but individually, all together, basically, with no exceptions. What really helps is when we speak with one voice with the US, because they do respect the role. They do respect actually that we are on one side of a certain debate, that we are there together. And if we speak with one voice, this is something that has an incredible impact on what China, and not just China, by the way, is doing in Western Balkans. If we do not do this, it will be misused by China, and again, not by China, and it will be to the detriment also of the EU and of its value-based system. We will have, and this is one of the reasons why we want enlargement to proceed. It's not because we are naive of wanting all the country and the EU be the biggest, but we see that with such a whole geographic hole in a way inside the EU, we would be vulnerable forever. And talking about more power to the EU or EU with more power, or even strategic autonomy with such a hole in a way inside your geographic territory is close to impossible. So again, I think on this line, on trying to not to have open confrontation, but to stay consistently together with the US against Chinese interest in specific parts of the world is, I think, a key, specifically for Western Balkans, with some possible scenarios for other regions in the world.
Well, thank you so much for that, Alish. I think this has been a wonderful sort of 360-degree tour of Europe and the world in an hour. I have tremendously enjoyed this conversation. I hope that our listeners have as well, by the looks of the questions that we've received. I think they have. Let me again thank you very, very warmly. Thank your embassy, your wonderful ambassador here in Rome, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks to all of you for being with us this evening. Thank you.